Admiral Zarath stood motionless, his eyes glued to the holographic display. The command room was quiet except for the soft hum of the ship's systems, which seemed almost peaceful compared to the storm of thoughts racing through Zarath's mind. The human child remained in the field, oblivious to the alien eyes watching from above. The alien admiral, usually so confident in his assessments, couldn't shake the odd sensation creeping over him. His species had studied humanity for years, yet there was something fundamentally perplexing about them. On the surface, Earth's inhabitants appeared primitive, disjointed in their technologies, lacking unity and cohesion. But there was always an underlying unpredictability to them, something difficult to pin down, something that had plagued Vorthian intelligence analysts for generations. They didn't fight like the Zaltha, with brute strength and overwhelming firepower. They didn't strategize like the Hirash, calculating each move with cold precision. No, humans fought with something else, something raw, something visceral. Zarath had watched countless hours of footage from Earth, wars, skirmishes, political unrest, but never had he been so intrigued by a single solitary figure. The child, with his messy brown hair and dirt-streaked clothes, was alone in a vast expanse of green. The Vorthian admiral had seen footage of human children playing before, simple games, running, laughing, as they practiced the art of cooperation and bonding. But this wasn't the same. Zarath leaned forward, zooming in on the child. The boy had placed a group of what appeared to be toy soldiers in a rough formation. At first glance, the figures looked like any child's plaything, plastic, rigid, and unremarkable. Yet, Zarath's heightened senses detected something that immediately struck him as odd. The boy's movements were purposeful. With a deliberate hand, he rearranged the toy soldiers as if setting up an army on a battlefield. His fingers moved with an unhurried but confident rhythm, each figure placed exactly where it needed to be. For a moment, Zarath believed this to be an innocent play session, until he saw the way the child studied his miniature battlefield. The boy didn't just move pieces around. He seemed to be evaluating the terrain. His small eyes flicked between the toys and the space around him, calculating. His hand hovered above one of the figurines, as if waiting for something. Then, with the precision of a tactician, the child made a small, decisive motion. One toy soldier was repositioned at the edge of the grouping, creating an almost imperceptible angle, as if the child was anticipating an enemy's next move. The boy, without breaking his focus, adjusted the rest of the figurines in a synchronized formation. Zarath's mind went cold. Was this some form of training? The child's play had taken on a new, unnerving direction. There was no joy in the way he played, no laughter, no excitement. It was all calculation, as though the child was orchestrating an unseen war, a conflict only he understood. Zarath had encountered many alien species in his career, but he had never seen a young mind display such tactical awareness. His eyes narrowed as he zoomed in further, watching the boy carefully. The figure in the child's hand wasn't just a toy anymore. It was part of a larger scheme, one that the child alone seemed to comprehend. Each move was deliberate, executed with the kind of precision that could only come from extensive training. Zarath's fingers hovered over his control panel, pulling up additional data on this particular human settlement. The child's parents were unaware of the secret unfolding beneath their roof, and even if they knew, they wouldn't understand what their child was truly capable of. This wasn't just a game. The more Zarath watched, the clearer it became. The child was practicing war. Real war. The Admiral's thoughts raced. He knew this was no ordinary play session. He had witnessed battle simulations before, where advanced technology allowed commanders to test their strategies in controlled environments. But what he was witnessing now was different. It wasn't technology guiding the play. It was instinct. A human child, without any formal training, was capable of orchestrating tactics that would make even the Vorthian commanders hesitate. Zarath leaned back in his chair, the full weight of what he had seen settling into his consciousness. This was no ordinary child. This was a glimpse of humanity's potential, and it was far more dangerous than anything he had ever expected. As Zarath continued to observe, his unease deepened. The child, unaware of the alien admiral's watchful eye, kept adjusting his miniature battlefield with a calm precision that was unsettling. The figures, now arranged in a perfect grid, seemed more like soldiers in a real army than simple plastic toys. The child moved each one with methodical care, placing them at calculated intervals, making small adjustments to their positioning as if he were creating a real war plan. Zarath's eyes flickered across the display, noting the careful consideration the child applied to every move. This wasn't mere play. The child glanced up at the horizon, scanning the open field before returning his focus to the toys. Zarath observed the subtle tension in the boy's posture. His fingers moved with purpose, as though he were waiting for something to happen, anticipating an attack, or perhaps even commanding the environment to react. This was no longer the innocent play of a child. This was the work of someone accustomed to complex decision-making, as if every toy was a piece in a larger game. The child didn't just move the pieces. He seemed to be thinking ahead, calculating possible outcomes. It wasn't long before the child's battle began to take shape. One of the toy soldiers, seemingly isolated, was being targeted by a group of others. The boy adjusted the position of one of the figures in response, providing the isolated soldier with reinforcements. Then, another piece was subtly shifted to create a perimeter, forming a defensive line. As if following a set of rules only he understood, the child mimicked battle formations, creating defensive blocks, ambushes, and counterattacks. Zarath's attention sharpened. Something strange began to happen. The environment around the child started reacting in sync with his play. A gust of wind stirred the grass at the edge of the field. A nearby bush rustled as though it, too, had sensed the change. It wasn't just a breeze. It felt like the world around the boy was aligning with his movements. Zarath's sensors had been monitoring the weather patterns for any anomalies, but there were no signs of unusual weather. It couldn't be a coincidence. The child seemed to have an uncanny ability to manipulate the terrain itself. How could this be possible? The child's game continued, becoming increasingly intricate. The toys, once arranged in simple lines, were now part of a well-executed plan. A skirmish, a standoff, and then a decisive ambush. The boy moved with the confidence of an experienced strategist, setting traps and executing maneuvers that would be difficult for even a seasoned soldier to anticipate. Zarath couldn't take his eyes off the display. Was this some sort of natural instinct? Or was the child drawing on hidden knowledge? The more Zarath observed, the more it seemed like the child wasn't simply playing a game. He was simulating a real military operation. The boy wasn't just moving plastic figures. He was commanding an invisible army, a small-scale war unfolding right before his eyes. But where had the child learned such techniques? The Vorthian Empire had studied human history extensively, and nowhere in Earth's past was there any evidence of a civilization capable of such tactical brilliance from such a young age. Zarath felt a cold shiver run down his spine. What if this wasn't a one-off anomaly? What if this child's behavior was not isolated, but something deeply ingrained in humanity's very nature? The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The child paused, staring down at his miniature army for a long moment. His eyes scanned the battlefield, calculating. It was as if he could see beyond the plastic toys, imagining their real-world counterparts, their movements, and the consequences of every action. Then, without warning, he made his final move, a swift, calculated strike that toppled the last remaining toy soldier in a decisive victory. Zarath felt his breath catch. The battle was over, and the child stood triumphantly over his fallen army. But the victory wasn't what disturbed him. It was the way the child had conducted the entire operation, the precision with which he had maneuvered his forces, anticipating every move and using every advantage available to him. Zarath was no longer watching a child at play. He was witnessing a young mind that had grasped the art of war with startling clarity. The Admiral leaned back, rubbing his temple. This is no game, he thought. This is something far more dangerous than I've ever imagined. Zarath's attention was riveted to the child as he continued to manipulate the figures with an eerie precision. The toys were now arranged in complex formations, each one contributing to a broader strategy that was beginning to take shape. Zarath zoomed in on the child's small hands, watching them move with deliberate care. Every action seemed to have a purpose, as though each placement of the miniature soldiers was part of a well-thought-out plan. The Admiral's gaze narrowed. He had seen battles unfold in countless ways, through the eyes of generals, tacticians, and warriors, but never had he witnessed such a sophisticated display from a child. The child paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the battlefield. For the first time, Zarath saw the boy's expression shift, a subtle furrow of concentration appearing on his face. The Admiral's sensors hummed as they picked up subtle fluctuations in the child's movements, almost as if the air around the boy was shifting in response to his mental calculations. There was a connection, a synchronicity, between the child's intentions and the very environment that surrounded him. Zarath could feel a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. Suddenly, the child made a move. One of the toy soldiers, previously stationed behind a small hill, was advanced into enemy territory, breaking the stalemate of the simulated battle. The figure didn't just march forward recklessly. It moved with the purpose of a scout gathering intelligence. The child was positioning the soldier as part of a reconnaissance mission, a strategy that would reveal the weaknesses of the opposing force. Zarath's mind raced. How does he know this? The Vorthian Admiral could scarcely believe what he was seeing. The battle scene was evolving, piece by piece, and with each new move, the child demonstrated a deeper understanding of military tactics. The child wasn't just thinking in terms of basic combat. He was thinking strategically, taking into account terrain, positioning, and the psychological impact of each maneuver. The figures were no longer just toys. They had become an extension of the child's mind, each one placed with intention, contributing to a larger, unfolding plan. The most disturbing part was how the child responded to each of his own moves. After advancing the scout, the boy didn't simply sit back and wait for the next action. Instead, he anticipated what his opponent would do next. The child adjusted the rest of the army, shifting pieces into defensive positions in preparation for a counterattack. It was a complex web of tactics that would be difficult to predict even for the most experienced commanders. And yet, the child was handling it with an ease that suggested this wasn't something he was merely imitating. This was instinct, born from an innate understanding of warfare. Zarath's heart raced. The child's military simulation was now expanding into something more sophisticated. The figures no longer represented just soldiers in a mock battle. They were now soldiers in a real war, each one acting as a cog in an intricate machine of strategy and counter-strategy. The boy had created a dynamic battlefield, constantly shifting in response to the simulated actions of the opposing side. The Vorthian Admiral could feel the tension mounting. The realization began to dawn on him. This child wasn't merely playing. He was conducting a mock war, testing his theories, refining his strategies, and adapting with remarkable speed. What terrified Zarath most was how quickly the boy's decisions were made, each one flowing naturally into the next as if the child were following some ancient, instinctive code of combat. The more Zarath watched, the more he understood that the child's mind was operating on a level that few military leaders, even within the Vorthian Empire, could achieve. This is no accident, Zarath thought. This is a human ability, perhaps even a deeply ingrained talent, born into their very psyche. The Admiral shifted uneasily in his chair, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him. Was this natural? Was it something inherent in the human race, waiting to be unlocked in every individual? The child had only just begun to develop, yet already he demonstrated the instincts of a seasoned commander. If this potential was widespread across the human population, then humanity itself could one day pose a threat greater than any species Zarath had encountered. Zarath's fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted the holographic feed, unable to tear his gaze away from the child's intricate war simulation. He had underestimated humanity for too long. But now, staring at this small human figure, Zarath realized just how dangerous the future of Earth could be. Zarath's mind whirred as the child continued to orchestrate his miniature battlefield. The boy's movements had become increasingly fluid, each piece of the puzzle falling into place with unnerving precision. It was as though the child were not only mimicking military tactics, but actually living them. The Admiral's fingers hovered over his console, pulling up more data on the child's location and surroundings. What exactly am I seeing? He wondered again. The human race had always been unpredictable, but this was beyond anything he had prepared for. The boy made another move, this time advancing a small group of soldiers into a thin line of trees that could be used for cover. The placement was perfect. The child understood the terrain's limitations and utilized every natural advantage, making it impossible for the opposing force to detect the new positioning. Zarath's sensors buzzed as they attempted to detect any anomalies in the environment, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. The Admiral's mind raced. It wasn't just the boy's uncanny understanding of warfare that troubled him. It was the way the terrain itself seemed to respond to the child's intentions. It was as if the battlefield were alive, reacting to his every move, adjusting to fit the child's vision. Could this be some form of latent telekinesis? Zarath questioned. He had read about rare psychic abilities in some species, powers that allowed individuals to influence their environment with their minds. But that was nothing more than myth in most cases, dismissed as fantasy. Yet, the energy fluctuations around the child were undeniable. Something was happening, something beyond conventional understanding. Zarath zoomed in on the child's face, searching for any clue to explain the strange synchronicity between the boy's actions and the environment. The boy's expression remained calm, almost detached, as he continued to direct his miniature army. It was as though he were utterly absorbed in his own world, a world where each toy soldier was not a child's plaything, but a real soldier, his soldiers, his responsibility. The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass around the child's field of play. The leaves of a nearby tree swayed gently, as if moved by an unseen hand. Zarath's heart raced again. It wasn't just the child's actions that were puzzling. It was the reaction of the world around him. The boy's deliberate movements seemed to be affecting the very fabric of his environment. The way the wind shifted, the way the grass bent. Could it be possible that the child was somehow manipulating the elements? Or was there something else at work here? Zarath leaned forward, his mind fighting to find an explanation. The thought gnawed at him. Could humanity, in all its chaotic unpredictability, possess a power that no other species had? What if the child was an anomaly, a rare individual with a gift that extended beyond natural military instinct? What if this ability existed across the population, dormant, waiting to awaken in other humans? What kind of threat could that pose to the Vorthian Empire? The idea sent a chill through Zarath's spine. If every human could harness this level of instinctual strategy, combined with the potential to manipulate their environment, it would change everything. It would mean that humanity could outmaneuver and outwit their enemies with ease, turning the tide of any battle, and possibly even war. Suddenly, the child stopped. His hand hovered above the battlefield, fingers trembling slightly. For a moment, Zarath thought he might be unsure of his next move. But then, as if drawn by some invisible force, the child shifted one final figure into place. It was a subtle change, but one that made all the difference. The positioning was flawless, a trap, a brilliant ambush. The child had set up an attack so devastating that even an experienced tactician might have overlooked it. The boy's fingers rested on the toy soldiers, but his eyes were now fixed on the horizon. It was as though he were waiting for something, or someone. Zarath's eyes widened. The child had completed the battlefield, but his focus wasn't solely on the simulation. It was as if he was anticipating the moment when the battle would actually play out. Zarath's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just the child's skill or his uncanny ability to command an army. It was the feeling that something greater was at play. The boy wasn't merely playing a game. He was preparing for a real battle, as if he had already seen the outcome, as if he knew exactly how it would unfold. The atmosphere on the observation deck grew heavy, and Zarath realized, with a sinking feeling, that what he had been witnessing was not just a game of war. The child had been practicing something far more significant, a future reality that was already shaping itself, and the Admiral had only just begun to understand the scale of what humanity could become. Zarath leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the image of the child. The boy's miniature battlefield had transformed once again, no longer a simple game, but a carefully executed plan. It was as if the child had woven together an entire campaign, a war, right before the Admiral's eyes. There was no doubt now. The child's instinct for warfare was extraordinary, and what had begun as a harmless display of play had become something much more disturbing. The child's fingers hovered over the battlefield for a moment, contemplating his next move. Zarath's breath hitched as the boy adjusted the position of one last soldier, a seemingly inconsequential figure tucked into the far corner of the playfield. But Zarath knew better now. Every move the child made, no matter how small, had meaning. It was a calculated decision, the final piece to a complex strategy. The child had set the stage for the final battle, one that would inevitably lead to victory. But it wasn't just the boy's strategic mind that terrified Zarath. It was the unsettling way the environment seemed to conform to his will. The wind howled across the field again, but this time, the air seemed charged with an unnatural energy. The grass around the boy bent in unnatural ways, as if responding to the child's presence. The trees shook in the distance, and the ground beneath the boy's feet seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly. Zarath's mind raced. Was this some kind of psychic ability? The way the child's surroundings reacted to him was too much to dismiss as coincidence. There had been no reports of humans possessing such powers, at least none that the Vorthian Empire had encountered. But what if this child was the first to unlock something deep within humanity's genetic makeup? What if every human had the potential to influence their environment, to direct the elements with their mind? The implications were terrifying. If this power existed on a large scale, humanity could become a force unlike any the galaxy had ever known. An army of humans, each capable of manipulating the environment and instinctively understanding strategy. Such a force could outmaneuver and overwhelm any opposition, including the Vorthian Empire. Zarath's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the sensors, trying to scan for any energy signatures or anomalies that might explain the strange occurrences around the child. But the more he searched, the more he realized that there were no detectable fluctuations in energy, no sign of advanced technology, no indication of some external influence. It was as if the child's mind was affecting the world in ways that defied any scientific explanation. The child's focus remained unwavering. His gaze was locked on the battlefield, the playfield now transformed into a vivid, intense struggle. The figures were no longer just toys. They were real soldiers in a real war. And the boy, this human child, was their commander, orchestrating every move with the certainty of a seasoned tactician. Zarath's pulse quickened. He had come to Earth with the belief that humanity was a species ripe for conquest. The Vorthian Empire had watched and studied Earth for years, calculating that humans would be an easy target. Divided, chaotic, weak in comparison to the sophisticated technologies and armies of the galaxy. But what he had underestimated was the mind of the human race. What he had failed to recognize was that the human instinct for survival, for adaptation, could manifest in ways that no technology or army could predict. The child made his final move. The last soldier, positioned in the corner, activated a trap, a hidden assault that quickly engulfed the opposing force, wiping out their last defense. Zarath watched in stunned silence as the battle unfolded. The child had not only won, he had executed a flawless victory, one that mirrored tactics from some of the most famous battles in history. It was as though the child had been born with the knowledge of warfare embedded deep in his DNA. For a moment, everything was still. The boy stared at the battlefield, watching the final moments of his triumph unfold before him. Zarath couldn't help but wonder. Did he know? Did he know that this game wasn't just a game at all? The answer was unsettling. The child had unlocked something. A power, an instinct, a force that was far beyond what any alien race had anticipated. This wasn't just a child playing war. This was humanity's potential manifesting, one mind at a time, and Zarath realized, with a creeping dread, that humanity's true strength was still hidden, waiting to be unleashed. Zarath's fingers twitched over the controls as he took one last look at the child. The boy had finished his game, but the message was clear. Humanity was not the weak, disorganized species the Vorthian Empire had believed them to be. They were something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. Zarath stared at the child's figure for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what had just transpired. His mind was a blur of conflicting thoughts and emotions. How could such a small, seemingly insignificant human have demonstrated such power, such tactical brilliance? What had started as a simple observation had turned into something far more dangerous, an awakening of sorts. The child had revealed a truth Zarath had hoped to ignore. Humanity was not what it appeared to be. The Admiral's fingers tightened around the armrests of his chair as he considered the implications. He had come to Earth with a single mission: to observe, assess, and ultimately subdue. The Vorthian Empire had long viewed humans as an easy target, unified only in their chaotic, divided nature, easily manipulated and conquered. The idea that humans might possess an innate, unrecognized power had never once crossed his mind. But now, staring at the child's serene face, Zarath could feel the weight of that realization settle heavily on his chest. He had assumed humans were predictable, primitive, even lacking the cohesion or strategic foresight that would make them a threat. But this child had demonstrated more tactical genius in a few short hours than some of the finest military minds in the galaxy. There was something in the human mind, something far more potent than simple instinct or learned behavior. This child had unlocked a power that was latent within all humans, and it was only a matter of time before that power would be realized on a massive scale. Zarath's eyes narrowed as he thought back to the simulation. The child hadn't just played. He had planned. Every move, every shift in the battlefield, had been executed with purpose and precision. And as the child's soldiers swept through the final battle, there had been no hint of hesitation or doubt. The boy knew exactly what he was doing, and what had started as a harmless toy battle had ended in a masterclass of military strategy. The Admiral's mind wandered to the implications of this new discovery. What if humanity had always possessed this capability? What if the child's success wasn't a fluke, but part of a larger, more terrifying pattern? What if every human, given the right circumstances, could unlock this latent power? It would mean that humanity could potentially command armies with the same effortless skill and instinct that the child had displayed. The idea sent a shiver down Zarath's spine. This wasn't just a tactical advantage. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of power. But Zarath couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt that now consumed him. If this power exists, can we stop it? The Vorthian Empire had countless weapons at its disposal: advanced technology, vast fleets, devastating weaponry. But nothing had prepared them for this. Nothing had prepared them for the idea that a race they had dismissed as primitive could possess such an innate connection to warfare, to strategy, and perhaps even to the very forces of nature itself. Zarath's hand twitched toward the communication console. He had to report this to his superiors. They needed to know what he had discovered, even if it defied every assumption the Empire had held about humanity. But the Admiral hesitated, his finger hovering over the transmission button. What if he was wrong? What if this was just an isolated incident? A fluke? The child's extraordinary ability could be unique, a rare exception. But what if it wasn't? He glanced back at the child, who now sat still, staring at his battlefield as though lost in thought. The wind had died down, and the trees surrounding the boy were eerily quiet. The air felt thick, charged with an energy Zarath couldn't explain. It was as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for the moment when humanity would reveal its true strength. Zarath's mind raced. What if we're too late? What if humanity has already awakened? With a sharp exhale, Zarath finally keyed in the transmission, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling in his mind. "Send this to command," he ordered. "I have discovered something on Earth. Humanity is not as we thought. They are capable of far more than we ever imagined." As the message was sent, Zarath sat back in his chair, his thoughts clouded by uncertainty. One thing was clear: the galaxy was about to change, and humanity, for better or worse, would be at the center of it all. Zarath's heart pounded in his chest as the transmission to his superiors went through. He hadn't known what to expect, but the sense of dread was palpable. The child, his tactical brilliance, and the strange phenomena surrounding him had left an indelible mark on the Vorthian admiral. Humanity was no longer a species he could dismiss, and the gravity of that knowledge began to settle like a stone in his gut. Minutes passed before a response finally came through, a cold, clipped voice emanating from the speaker. "Admiral Zarath, this is High Command. We have received your report. You are to continue monitoring the situation and gather further intelligence on this human child. Do not act without authorization." Zarath's jaw tightened. The message was typical, detached, and bureaucratic, one that offered no comfort or clarity. It was a command from a species that, for centuries, had ruled the galaxy with an iron fist. But Zarath knew better than to disregard it. The Vorthian Empire had always prided itself on its precision, its overwhelming strength, and its ability to control every situation. But the potential of humanity, what he had just witnessed, was something different, something that defied the Empire's vast military might. "Understood," Zarath replied coldly, his voice betraying none of his growing concern. "I will continue the observation, but I advise caution. This power could be far more dangerous than we realize." There was a pause on the other end of the transmission. "We will send a team to Earth in due course to assess the situation in person. For now, keep a low profile. Do not engage with the humans directly. We will issue further instructions once we have more data." Zarath clicked off the transmission, his mind racing. The command had come with typical Vorthian authority, indifferent to the seriousness of the situation. But Zarath knew that no matter how much they tried to downplay it, the discovery he'd made could change everything. He was on the front lines of something that could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. Humanity's ability to instinctively strategize, paired with the possibility that they could influence their surroundings, was an unforeseen threat, one that could challenge the might of the entire empire. Sitting in silence, Zarath's gaze turned back to the holographic display. The child, now in the center of the simulation, was completely still. His hand hovered over the battlefield, not moving, as if the game had ended. But Zarath couldn't shake the feeling that the child wasn't finished, that the true test was yet to come. A sudden thought struck Zarath, something he had failed to consider in his initial panic. What if this child isn't the only one? What if the potential he'd witnessed wasn't limited to a rare anomaly, but was, instead, widespread? If every human had the ability to do what the child had done, the Empire's entire strategy would be compromised. The idea of humanity coordinating and using advanced tactics on a scale even beyond their own understanding would be enough to shift the power dynamics across the galaxy. Suddenly, Zarath's console beeped again, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. A new transmission from High Command appeared, this time with a more urgent tone. "Admiral, we have received word that Earth is beginning to mobilize. Intelligence reports that they have detected an unusual surge in global military coordination. They are preparing for something. We need you to act quickly. Observe and, if necessary, neutralize the child's influence before the situation escalates. We cannot afford to let them gain momentum." The weight of the order fell heavily on Zarath's shoulders. The calm, rational part of his mind knew that neutralizing the child might be the only way to prevent a galactic conflict. But another part, an instinct he couldn't quite shake, told him that eliminating one human would do nothing to solve the underlying issue. If humanity's potential was indeed as great as he feared, no single action could stop it. It was not just a war with Earth he was facing. It was a war with a species that had evolved to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast. Zarath's mind spun in circles as he tried to find the right course of action. On one hand, he had orders to act quickly, to strike first, and ensure that humanity's potential was squashed before it could grow. On the other, there was something deeply unsettling about the way the child had demonstrated his abilities. It wasn't the power of a brute or a soldier. It was the power of a strategist, someone who understood how to bend the world to his will. Zarath knew one thing for certain. The stakes were far higher than a simple conquest of Earth. The Vorthian Empire was facing an adversary whose true capabilities had yet to be fully revealed, and the future of the galaxy hung in the balance. He turned away from the console, his gaze lingering on the child's last movement in the simulation. There was no turning back. Zarath stood at the edge of the observation deck, his gaze locked on the holographic image of the child. The boy was still, his tiny hands hovering above the battlefield, his eyes distant, as if contemplating something far beyond the simulation. Zarath couldn't help but feel a sense of awe mixed with fear. This was no longer just about a single child or even Earth. It was about the future of the galaxy. The message from High Command echoed in his mind. Neutralize the child's influence before the situation escalates. But what did that really mean? The Vorthian Empire had always relied on overwhelming strength, tactical superiority, and fear. It had been their method of maintaining control for centuries, but the revelation of humanity's untapped potential had shattered that foundation. Zarath clenched his fists at his sides. The child's brilliance, his ability to manipulate the battlefield with such precision and foresight, was not something to be dismissed. It wasn't just an individual skill. It was a potential power within all humans, waiting to be realized. And if the child had tapped into it, what would happen when others did the same? What if humanity was capable of forming armies not just with physical strength, but with a collective strategic mind that could reshape entire conflicts? As the Admiral pondered, a deep sense of unease crept over him. The Empire had long believed it could control any species, using technology and superior tactics to suppress any form of resistance. But this child, this human, was different. He didn't rely on technology or brute force. He relied on instinct, on something innate, something that couldn't be quantified or predicted. Zarath's mind flashed back to the battlefield he had witnessed. The child's soldiers had advanced with the perfect coordination of a well-oiled machine, responding to every shift in the environment, exploiting every opportunity. The battle had unfolded like a complex chess game, and the child had been its grandmaster. But it wasn't just the child's strategy that was impressive. It was the way the world had seemed to bend to his will. The wind, the grass, the trees, everything had seemed to react to the child's presence, as if nature itself had been enlisted in the war. It was as though the child wasn't playing a game at all. He was preparing for something far greater. Zarath felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck. The reports from High Command were clear. Humanity was beginning to mobilize, to unite in ways that had never been seen before. A surge in global military coordination, they had said. They were preparing for something. But what? Could it be that the entire species was awakening to this hidden potential? If so, the balance of power in the galaxy was at risk. The Admiral's heart raced. He had to act. But what action would be the right one? High Command's orders were direct. Neutralize the threat before it became uncontrollable. But Zarath couldn't shake the feeling that eliminating this child, or even humanity as a whole, wouldn't be enough. The power that he had witnessed wasn't something that could be destroyed. It was something that could only grow. He thought of his own people, the Vorthian Empire, which had crushed countless species beneath its boot. They had conquered, subjugated, and dominated. But for the first time, Zerath realized that they might be the ones who were vulnerable. Humanity's hidden potential had the power to outmaneuver them, to shift the very fabric of war in ways they could never anticipate. And it wasn't just the child. This power could be universal, latent in every human being, waiting to be awakened. Zerath's hand hovered over the console again, torn between duty and the terrifying unknown. He had always followed orders without question. But this time, something inside him hesitated. What if the true threat wasn't humanity, but the fear the Empire had of something it didn't understand? What if the galaxy was on the cusp of an evolution, a shift in power that could no longer be controlled by old methods? With a deep breath, Zerath made his decision. He keyed in a command on the console, sending a message back to High Command. Admiral Zerath reporting. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. I recommend delaying any action against Earth. Humanity's true potential is not yet understood. We must observe, not attack. The child's abilities, this connection to strategy, to nature, are only the beginning. I believe humanity may be on the verge of something far greater than we anticipated. He paused, his fingers trembling slightly as he added, It is possible that we have misjudged them. Zerath leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving the image of the child. The decision had been made, but there was no certainty in it, no promise of safety. He had chosen to take a risk, to allow humanity the time to reveal its true power. Whether that decision would lead to a future of cooperation or war, he couldn't know. But one thing was clear, Earth was no longer just a footnote in the galaxy's history. It was a force to be reckoned with. And Zerath would watch, waiting to see how humanity's story would unfold.